Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder Historian, and a few weeks ago, I asked you all to put some questions forward in the comment section of one of my posts, and that I would answer them at a later date. You all put together some great questions, so now here are the answers. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop, and join the Patreon page. Thank you all so much, and enjoy. Brian Schroer 7331 asked, outside of a battle, what do you believe was the most crucial decision made in the war? This could be from a political stance, a military appointment or slight, or anything else along these lines. Thank you again for what you do. You are very welcome, Brian. That's a great question. It's hard to talk about a political stance or anything else in the Civil War because there is almost always a military contingency related to them. I guess there would be two that would duke it out for the top spot. One is placing Grant in charge of all Union armies, because when you put him and Sherman in separate theaters, they would work together nonetheless. Sherman was thrilled with the situation because he finally saw that the Union had a stated goal and two men that were more than happy to work together toward that common goal. Up until that point, many of those Union armies worked independently of one another without a clear goal to work toward together. Don't get me wrong, they had goals, but lots of time they weren't talking to one another. The other one would probably have to be the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed slaves in areas that were still under rebellion, so technically it didn't free any because those states would not honor that proclamation. However, that wasn't why it was so important. Lincoln knew that slave owners would talk about the proclamation and slaves would hear about it, meaning that slaves would know that if they got to Union lines, they were indeed free. Many took that chance without the proclamation, but that solidified it. It also, and many people forget this, but it allowed African American males to join the United States Army. The proclamation allowed the Union Army to swell up larger than it was and gave them additional manpower. I hope this answers your question, and thank you so much for asking it. Martin Laird 4738 asked, why did the Union only have one Lieutenant General, Grant, and numerous Major Generals? The second question, being unrelated, is, who do you think could have been the best Army commander for the Army of Tennessee? The rank of Lieutenant General had only been occupied by one man in American history up to that point, and that was George Washington. So that position was kept in high regard. That's why you had a bunch of Major Generals, and their rank depended on when they were given that promotion. It could be incredibly complicated. Lincoln gave Ulysses S. Grant the rank of Lieutenant General for two reasons. One, it demonstrated the confidence he had in Grant, and two, that way there would be no general to get in his way when he tried to implement strategy. Lincoln had great faith in Grant, and he wanted him to have free rein. For your second question, the best commander of the Army of Tennessee, and I'm going to assume that you mean who may have had the opportunity to do so in that time, I would say William J. Hardee. He's the one I would choose who had the opportunity at the time of the Civil War. Lee wouldn't leave the Virginia theater. Leonidas Polk wasn't capable enough of a commander, and I don't think any of the other corps commanders in the Army of Tennessee had demonstrated enough skill to command it either. The only man that would have had the capability of commanding the army and the skill, other than Hardee, would have probably been Edmund Kirby Smith, but again, I don't think he demonstrated the ability to lead an army better than Hardee. ManAtArms 7652 asked, what parts of either the American Civil War or history in general are you most interested in? By that I mean any part of history that never feels like a slog to learn about. I know it may sound cliche, but there is not one part of history that I'm not interested in. Of course, I love battles. I'm forever mesmerized by first-hand accounts and descriptions of battles because I can't imagine what those men went through. Nothing really feels like a slog, in all honesty. The only thing I got tired of was the first biography series I did, which was Leonidas Polk. I was ready for him to die long before I got there in the series. So, to answer your question, battles, large and small, are my favorite things to study, and I always need a good map to go along with them. So that's why I love putting together those animated battle maps. It helps me visualize the battles just like it helps everyone else. History and Horseplaying 7374 asked, would the war have gone differently, such as would Gettysburg have taken place if the Jones and Bowdoin raid had been far more successful, if they had prevented West Virginia from seceding, which was one of the goals of the raid? In short, yes, the Gettysburg campaign would have taken place whether West Virginia became a state or not, whether the raid was successful or not. The campaign was long planned and needed to happen for logistical reasons. Basically, Lee needed food. Would the destruction of the B&O Railroad have helped Lee's invasion? Probably, but I don't think it made any significant difference. Would the war have gone differently had it been successful? Also, probably not. Engineers would have quickly repaired and rebuilt all the railroads. The raid would have made things slow down as far as supplies coming east, but it wouldn't have debilitated the Union Army, at least not for long. Matt Sinclair 9149 asked, most of the things I've read paint Bragg as incompetent, but from watching your coverage of the Western battles, I struggle to understand how any general could succeed with subordinates repeatedly refusing to follow orders. So my question, how much of Bragg's failures in the West were down to incompetent, mutinous subordinates versus how much was down to Bragg's shortcomings? This is a great question. I think those two factors are intertwined. Bragg's shortcomings of being abrasive with his subordinates led them to being mutinous and unwilling to follow orders. A good example of that is Longstreet around Chattanooga. Bragg gave him support to take back Brown's Ferry and secure Lookout Valley, but Longstreet decided to make the attack with only one division. At Stones River, Bragg's plan of attack was sound, but one of his subordinates went the wrong direction and forced the reserve to enter the front line prematurely. I say that a lot of Bragg's problems was with his subordinates, and not that his subordinates were bad. Many of them were great commanders, but he didn't communicate with them effectively or have their respect. In either type of situation, I would blame the subordinates more than Bragg's personal shortcomings, but they are definitely intertwined. Check out my video on Bragg and McClellan describing who was better to get more of an explanation of Bragg. Andrew Seaton 8353 asked, what is your opinion of Lee's Lieutenants by Douglas Freeman? It dates from the 1940s, so is there an updated edition of it, or is one even needed? Is there a Union version of it? If that even makes sense, given the revolving door for top Union generals. Lee's Lieutenants is a great resource, but you're right, it is completely dated. Updates are always needed. Hardly anything stands the test of time. Historians and archives find new sources all the time that confuses the narrative, so I definitely think a new one needs to be written. There's a great series called Grant's Lieutenants that I would highly recommend that you check out. Also, there have been some smaller studies that mimic Lee's Lieutenants as well. Jaybird 1988 asked, what is the difference between a military department and a proper army? For example, the Department of Ohio versus the Army of Northeastern Virginia. This is another great question. I'll try to answer it succinctly here, but if you'd like me to do a long-form video, let me know, because I'd sure like to do it. I'll start with how the Confederacy viewed departments. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, believed that the best way to fight the war was to have departments throughout the Confederacy, and when a Union army invaded, all the departments would band together, defeat the foe, and then go back to their respective departments. That didn't work out the way he hoped, although a few departments had success. Within those departments, you had commanders of the departments, but they also had smaller contingents, like divisions and brigades, spread all over their departments. The commander of the department would call them all together for an operation. The best example of this is Edmund Kirby Smith and the Army of East Tennessee, Department of East Tennessee. It only operated as an army once, and that was during the Kentucky campaign. For the Union, it was similar yet different. Let's use the example of Sherman right before the Atlanta campaign. He commanded the military division of the Mississippi. Within that department, he had multiple armies and a set territory for him to operate in. Departments grew as progress was made. Sometimes armies made up the entire department, and sometimes the departments were scattered forces. It really depended on the territory. Sorry that I couldn't be more specific, but any more detail would require an entire video. If you'd like me to do that in a future video, please let me know. I'd be happy to do it. Kimberly Ann DeMong 5621 asked, I preface this by saying I'm sorry. I hate what-if questions because there are no answers, but this one I need an opinion I can trust. Since Virginia and North Carolina were two of the last four to secede, would North Carolina have stayed in the Union if Virginia had not seceded? I feel like once Virginia and Tennessee left, North Carolina would have had no choice. Excellent question from one of my longtime subscribers. Thank you for being a fan, Kimberly. Virginia and North Carolina made up some of the greatest numbers of fighting-age males in the Confederacy and much of the industrialization and railroads. Because the two states were so tightly bound, if Virginia didn't leave the Union, I don't quite see North Carolina leaving either. It would be similar to Kentucky. Yes, it was connected to the South, but the railroads had made it very reliant on connecting it to the northern economy, one reason that Kentucky stayed in the Union. You're right, once Virginia left, North Carolina had an easier decision, whether they wanted to make that decision or not. Their economy was so linked with Virginia that it basically had to go. One little historical factoid that I'll throw in is that tobacco growers in North Carolina and Virginia got a boost in their financial situation because without Kentucky tobacco growers selling to the South, North Carolina and Virginia growers could capitalize on it. Those tobacco planters would refuse to grow food for the Confederate armies, growing tobacco instead because it was so lucrative of a crop and situation. Andy Baker 5466 asked, what were the factors why the Confederates lost so badly, especially in the end of the war? The Confederacy, on a couple of occasions, had opportunities to win, either by a devastating defeat that would have made the United States want to stop fighting, or by prolonging the conflict long enough to have the war weariness set in, and then the Northern public would call for an end to the war. On the reverse, war weariness was setting in on the Confederacy. The public was tired of the conflict, as well as the soldiers. Desertions were up because the Union launched multiple invasions of the South and were bringing the war to the people's doorstep. This made a lot of soldiers in every major Confederate army say, I'm going home to take care of my family. But I will clarify, I'm talking about the last 6 to 8 months of the conflict. The will of the people was given out, and that was one of the biggest reasons that the Confederacy lost so badly at the very end. D. Smith 2568 asked, I have a question. Who's running the Dwarf Kingdom while you're out gallivanting around making cool history vids? Well, I resigned my position as king. The Dwarf Kingdom has become a republic, like it should have been all along. The Dwarf Congress graciously gave me a pension for my service to the kingdom, so that's why I'm able to travel and do these videos. This has been great fun. Thank you all so much for submitting questions. I hope I did them justice. Keep the comments coming under the videos. Let me know what you want to see. I'm incredibly humbled by all the support that I get and want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart.